Fishman. This is my final project for CSCI E185 Big Data Analytics. It's a case study in journalism, and I'm examining Wikipedia's use of news sources. So to give a little background of what I'm talking about here, Wikipedia articles are required to cite the source of the information that they present. So in this case, I'm showing a screenshot for the article on the recent Boston Marathon bombing, and you can see that this article cites several hundred sources, and these sources include newspapers. You can see that the Boston Globe is cited several times, as well as the websites of news channels on TV like CNN and Fox News. So the question here is, what news sources are most frequently cited in Wikipedia articles? And this can help us answer some deeper questions, such as whether or not Wikipedia editors are tending to use high-quality news sources or lower-quality sources. Are Wikipedia editors using a variety of sources, or do they use just a couple of sources? Do Wikipedia editors prefer sources with a particular viewpoint? Do they prefer sources from a particular part of the world? Since anyone can edit Wikipedia, it's an interesting question to see whether or not the sources that are used reflect the diversity of the community of editors, or whether sources from one particular political perspective or one particular region are preferred. Finally, an emerging issue in the media industry is this question of newspaper paywalls. For many years, newspapers allowed anyone on the internet to read their articles on their websites for free. What's happened over the last several years is that as the newspaper revenues from print subscriptions have declined, newspapers have instituted these paywalls, which allow you to read, say, 10 articles in a given month, and then you have to buy a subscription to the newspaper in order to read more. So one question in the industry is whether or not instituting a paywall is going to dramatically decrease the influence of a given newspaper, since people on the internet have so many choices for where they can get their news, and people are always sharing links to newspaper articles with each other. The Wikimedia Foundation provides regular dumps of the Wikipedia database. Wikipedia is enormous. It has 4.25 million articles in the English version. So just the text of the current articles is about 60 gigabytes uncompressed, and that's just the current revisions. If you want to look at the entire history of every article and every single revision, that gets into the terabytes uncompressed. In this case, I'm looking at a specific database table, which is a table of external links. An external link is a link from a Wikipedia article to some other website. This is a table that it has one column which has the IDs, the primary key IDs for the articles, and then it has another column which has a URL. This is a bit more of a reasonable size to work with. It's about 10 gigabytes. However, it's in SQL format, so I had to use a utility from the Wikimedia Foundation to convert it into a tab delimited file with one URL on each line. I then performed some data analysis on this file. I prepared a list of the domains of 150 news websites, including the 100 highest circulation newspapers in the United States as calculated by the Audit Bureau of Circulation. I then wrote a couple of small Python programs. One is a mapper that looks at every line in the external links file, every external link, and it checks to see if that link matches the domain from one of these news sites. I then used a reducer to aggregate the results. And then I ran this on Amazon Elastic MapReduce using Hadoop streaming. I'm not going to go into too much detail in this PowerPoint presentation on the process because I've spelled that out in a walkthrough, and I've provided the sample code and I want to focus a little more on the results, but that sample code is available for you. Briefly, I want to talk a little bit about the limitations of this approach. In this case, this worked perfectly fine using this external link database table. However, if I wanted to go back and analyze that multi-terabyte archive of every revision, it would be much more difficult to do that with Elastic MapReduce, because these are XML files, but each XML object, page object, may be a gigabyte or more in length. And one of the things that the Wikimedia Foundation has warned about is that these file sizes Hadoop's XML stream reader can break down and give poor results. So the Wikimedia Foundation has provided some custom software called Wiki Hadoop, which will process this data, but unfortunately it requires a different version of Hadoop than Elastic MapReduce supports. So I was able to use this Wiki Hadoop on a very small test set of a few megabytes on my local machine, but I don't have the capability to process terabytes of data on my local machine, and it would be impossible to, it wouldn't be possible to do it. And unfortunately, it seems like doing it in Elastic MapReduce at the moment would also be somewhat difficult and require quite a workaround. Now, there are some edge cases. So I've gone through and I've gotten this list of newspaper URLs, and for each newspaper, how many times it's linked to by Wikipedia. But there are some edge cases, and the edge cases involve news archiving services. So, for instance, let's say Wikipedia cites an article from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Well, it may very well cite a copy of that article that sits on a Google News server rather than on the newspaper's server. So that's going to throw off the results a bit. So what I had to do was, in these two cases, these two archivers, Google News and ProQuest Archiver, I had to use Hadoop to generate a list of URLs of articles that on those websites that are being cited, and then I had to go through and extract the newspaper name. In the case of ProQuest Archiver, the newspaper name is embedded in the URL, so I just used a regular expression to extract it, and I used a mapper and reducer to aggregate the results. In the case of Google News, it was a little bit more complicated the results. In the case of Google News, it was a little bit more complex because the newspaper name is not in the URL, but it is in the actual HTML file. So I had to use a Python script, create a Python script using this beautiful soup library to actually download that URL and then parse the HTML, extract the newspaper name. And then I used the mapper and the reducer to aggregate that. All of this is described in the project report. So now I want to talk a bit about the results. What you see here is a chart of the newspapers that are American newspapers that are cited the most frequently on Wikipedia. The red line shows the number of citations, and the blue bars show the circulation of the newspaper's daily circulation as a point of comparison so that we can see their relative sizes. And one of the things that immediately jumps out is that the New York Times, which is a very well respected newspaper, has a circulation of over 1.5 million, is cited it's cited over or just about 300,000 times. And the next biggest newspaper that's cited is the Washington Post, which is considerably smaller in circulation, and it's cited about 60,000 times. And then another very highly respected newspaper, the Wall Street Journal, which has a circulation of over 2 million, so larger circulation than the New York Times, is only cited about 26,000 times. So we can see very clearly that we have one source that is used in order of magnitude more often than some of the other sources that have a similar scope and circulation. This is just an expanded version of this chart that shows more newspapers, and you can see here again that the New York Times is used to a tremendous amount, and it really kind of blows everything else out of the water. By comparison, other newspapers, many of these are, well-respected regional newspapers, are used relatively, perhaps at most 10,000 times. We can see that there are a handful of newspapers such as the Boston Globe and the San Francisco Chronicle that are used considerably more than that. This is a result for TV news sources, and what we can see again is we can see that one source is used extremely often. That's the BBC. It's used 337,000 times. And then some of the major American networks, Fox, NBC, CBS, are used maybe about 16,000, 18,000 times. So there are some interesting questions that this raises. The New York Times and the Wall Street Journal are both very well respected, very well read. They have a global scope in their coverage and in their readership. And yet one is used in order of magnitude more often than another. One possible explanation of this is that the Wall Street Journal implemented a paywall way back in 1997, which means that only subscribers could access it. The New York Times waited until 2011 to do that. So the fact that people on the internet could read the New York Times for free for a lot longer than they could read the Journal might explain part of the reason why that the New York Times is preferred to such an extent. I also want to highlight two cases, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Both of these have very similar circulations, but Pittsburgh Post-Gazette is cited 3 times as frequently. And one reason for this, it doesn't explain the entire difference, but it explains a significant chunk of it, is that the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette makes its archives available for free on Google News, meaning that articles from this newspaper from even as far back as the 50s or the 60s can still be used in Wikipedia articles. If you wanted to do that with another newspaper that doesn't make its archives available, you would have to, go down to the library and get that off of microfilm, which is considerably more difficult. So that's potentially a reason why newspapers might consider putting their archives online on a service like Google News, is that people will use them and it will generate, if not links to the newspaper website, then mentions of that newspaper. I also wanted to highlight that there are 2 international newspapers that I looked at from Israel, Haaretz and the Jerusalem Post, are each cited a huge number of times relative to their circulation. They both have circulations under 75,000, and yet they're cited about 14,000 times or 12,000 times, respectively. So that leads me to believe that one factor in determining how often a newspaper is cited is the topic that it specializes in. Certain topics on Wikipedia tend to be covered in a great deal more depth than other topics. The Middle East being a very controversial subject is one where editors really have to use a lot of sources in order to defend the changes that they want to make. So, just some final thoughts on this. I was a little bit surprised to find that a very small number of sources are used disproportionately. This is interesting given that on Wikipedia, anyone can edit from anywhere in the world. Whatever newspaper they choose to read, they can use. And yet editors seem to be converging on a fairly small number of sources, which is interesting. The second observation is that the sources that editors are choosing are well respected. Sources that are considered more lowbrow or of a lower quality, USA Today or the New York Post, even if they have a very high readership, are not used particularly often. So I have some ideas for further research. One, if I am able to analyze these terabytes of history, it might be interesting to look at the rates at which different newspapers were added to Wikipedia. It might be interesting because it might be interesting to see whether putting up a paywall, as the New York Times did in 2011 and as the Wall Street Journal did in 1997, will affect the rate at which editors add links to a particular newspaper. It makes sense that it would. And then I'd also like to use the geotags in Wikipedia articles to create maps of the world that show where the sources, which to show which parts of the world use which newspapers in their coverage. So, for instance, it might be interesting to look at articles about the Middle East and see, specific to the Middle East,